bourgeoisie produces, above all, art zone. Grave diggers.
Hey everyone.
Hey folks, we're back.
This is Aaron in Seoul.
And it's Amr in Toronto, and this is part of our Arab Spring series, and today we have a special one.
Yeah, we do. Happy holidays, everyone.
Yeah, if you are listening to this, it will be on Tuesday, the 22nd of December, so happy holidays, happy Hanukkah, Merry Christmas, etc., etc. I just said Merry Christmas, which, given that we're in the middle of a war on Christmas, a jihad, if you will, I can hear secret police knocking on my door to black bag me for saying Merry Christmas, the liberal police.
The coffee cups where I get my coffee before work here in Seoul say Merry Christmas, and I can just picture Americans
That is great.
freaking out.
I mean, first of all, Americans would freak out because that's blasphemy. Second of all, that is a very cringe pun. It's a very dad joke.
Oh, that's Korea, my friend.
But they do have the cute cartoons, you said. The
Cacao Friends.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you have never heard of them, stop this podcast, look up Cacao Friends, and try to make sense of it.
Yeah, I tried to, and I still struggle.
So here we are, 10 years on from the Arab uprisings. This is episode number 2 for us. We did Tunisia last week, so...
Yeah, you don't have to listen.
Yeah.
But I think it is better to listen, if only to, get a better gist of how things went. We're going from west to east, so next up is the big one. I think this is the big one. This is the one that most of the media focused on during the revolutions, initially at least, and it's Egypt.
Right, this is the one that I mostly remember, considering I was a teenager, and so were you when this happened, a young teenager.
Yeah, I mean, I remember more Bahrain because I lived through that one. But even when I was in Bahrain, the media was covering Egypt much more extensively. It was the center, in my opinion.
Yeah, and it's important to point out, I think, too, Egypt is a cultural center of the Arab world. Like, lots of films, lots of novels, things like that are Egyptian.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Egypt, it creates the culture of the region. And, that being said, it is understandable that people are more familiar with Egypt than elsewhere because of the cultural power they have, really.
But did you know, in Egypt, they don't say Egypt, they say Egypt.
Funny. Well, they don't say either. They say Masar, but yes.
I know. Into Jahiz, or I'm sorry, into Gahiz.
I don't get why they do that. I'm sorry, I don't get why they do that because I am a Jim supremacist. I don't believe the Ga should exist. But we are ready. We are Zein. The people demand the downfall of the regime. This is the cry echoed by tens of thousands of Egyptians as they occupied Tahrir Square on January 25th, 2011. By the way, the Arabic translation for that they were saying was "Ash-sha'b yurid isqat an-nizam." That cry was echoed across the region, but especially in Tahrir Square. And January 25th, at that point, was observed or celebrated in Egypt annually as Police Day. But unlike previous years, this January 25th saw the rage of a people brutalized by the police for years explode onto the streets. Perhaps the most famous of the Arab uprisings, and certainly the one most covered at the time, Egypt, at this point, is witnessing its own revolution. Egyptians had flooded the streets of Cairo and marched onto Tahrir Square in the middle of the city, demanding bread, freedom, and social justice. And of course, roughly 2 weeks of struggle, they succeeded. Hosni Mubarak stepped down on February 11, 2011, ushering in what many optimists saw as a dawn of a new era in Egypt. At that point, following the fall of Zein Abedine bin Ali in Tunisia, the dominoes were following eastwards, and like a sleeping tiger, Egypt has awoken. Before I get into the revolution, I want to give you guys a bit of background on Egypt, especially, and its particular contexts. Egypt, at the beginning of the 20th century, was a monarchy, but on the 23rd of July, 1952, a group of middle-ranking officers in the Egyptian military overthrew the monarchy of King Farouk at the time and replaced it with a republic under initially General Muhammad Najib, who was the highest ranking officer within this cadre. So Najib, whichever side of the fence you lean on, and clearly my co-host is on the other side of me here. He was the highest ranking officer, so he got to be president, but the real mover and shaker, the real power behind the throne, if you will, a metaphorical throne at this point, is Gamal Abdel Nasser. In 1956, Gamal Abdel Nasser officially replaces Najib after 4 years of intra-officer rivalry. Abdel Nasser out-tactics Najib, he outsmarts him and gets rid of him. I don't want to get too into the weeds here, but on the 28th of September 1970, Nasser dies of a heart attack and he is replaced by what he thought was his pliable vice president, Anwar Sadat. But Sadat, now president in his own right, embarks on what he calls infitah policies, which ultimately result in privatizing swathes of the Egyptian public sector, which was robust under Nasser, and essentially rolling back Nasser's planned economy.
Infitah literally means openness in Arabic, though scholars usually translate this to the open door policy. Sadat quite literally opened up the Egyptian economy to meddling by the likes of the IMF, which, as we discussed in our previous episode on Tunisia, led to disastrous effects. I'm going to read a quote from Hazem Kandil's book, Soldiers, Spies, and Statesmen. Quote, "What Infitah did in fact create were millionaires. Thousands of millionaires in an overwhelmingly poor society. Moreover, these millionaires were no great industrialists who might eventually expand the job market, but were rather importers, money changers, and middlemen, as well as rehabilitated ancien regime landowners. Whether this band of investors constituted a full-blown comprador bourgeoisie or simply a mafia, the consequence is the same. They contributed neither to industry nor employment. More dangerous still was Infitah's redistributional effects. World Bank statistical findings in 1980 spelled out how the distributive effects of Sadat's economic liberalization threatened to create class tensions. While the poorest 20% of the population controlled 5% of the national income, the share of the highest 5% was 22%. The share of the richest 10% was 33%, and that of the richest 20% was more than 50% of the national income." End quote. In other words, Infitah created massive economic inequality in Egypt, which, of course, abetted social inequality as well.
Yeah, that is a really good quote. I think the part where he mentions they contributed neither to industry nor employment, that is a very important part. Unlike the bourgeoisie in industrial Europe in the 18th, 19th centuries, this class of new money, they weren't really contributing to the development of the economy of Egypt. They were just parasites that found wealth through financial instruments more so than any economic development as such. And this created, like you said, massive disparity. However, it was the peace that Sadat had made with Israel following the war. Sadat ends up signing the Camp David Accords, and that pisses off a bunch of Islamists in Egypt, and they end up assassinating him on the 6th of October 1981, and he is succeeded by none other than Hosni Mubarak.
We did one of our first episodes ever on the assassination of Anwar Sadat. I think it's like episode 2. So if you're in the mood for some less polished Das Criminal, scroll down.
Shout out to the Day One Club. Hosni Mubarak's Egypt took off from where Anwar Sadat's ended with rampant corruption. The people want a book by Gilbert Eshkar, a Trotskyist in, I believe,
He's at SOAS.
SOAS, yes. I have my issues with him, but the book is pretty good in exploring the economic context behind the revolutions. He does highlight how roughly 70% of the Egyptian economy was in the informal sector prior to the revolution, which is to say that it was not public sector nor official corporations, but things like vegetable stall owners and things of that nature. Another important part of Egypt was conscription. So conscription was for all men that weren't only sons in the family, but the military was very corrupt. A lot of men got out of conscription if they bribed the right person. If you did end up being conscripted, unless you knew the right people, you would end up in very unpleasant stations. So like they'll fuck you off to like the Suez or like Aswan with minimal supply. So it was quite unpleasant. However, this conscription does explain a certain popular respect for the military that wasn't present for the government or the police. And I will get into that later. But just to clarify, yes, there was conscription. And Mubarak did sort of meddle with the trappings of a democracy. It wasn't a democracy by any means, but he didn't just rule by default. He did organize elections, but he was the sole candidate for the presidential elections from 1981 on his ascension to 2005. And 2005, following some, discontent, he did allow the elections to be quote unquote contested. However, he did win 88.6% of the vote. So make of that what you will. Another issue was him grooming his son Gamal or Jamal, whichever pronunciation my co-host would say Gamal, I would say Jamal, right, Erin?
I say what they say. If it's Egypt, I use the Geem. In Palestine, I would say Jamal.
Fair enough. You respect the local cultures and traditions, whereas I am a pure Arab purist, if you will.
Gulf imperialism.
Which we'll get into, by the way, in this episode. There is something in this episode and the next episode regarding local Gulf imperialism. So funny you brought that up. But Gamal was being groomed to succeed him, and a lot of Egyptians were not happy with that. Also, Egypt was under emergency law. So since the assassination of Anwar al-Sadat, Egypt has been placed under emergency law where habeas corpus is suspended, various civil rights are suspended, and so on. These ingredients pretty much left the pot stirring, basically on the verge of explosion. There was all this discontent from all these factors. Last but not least, there was an online campaign in 2010 started by Wa'il Ghunim, a Google exec. And the campaign is called We Are All Khalid Saeed, referencing a man, Khalid Saeed, who was killed by the police on the 6th of June 2010. And the campaign is supposed to reflect police brutality in Egypt and a lack of accountability.
So this page, We Are All Khalid Saeed, or Kulna Khalid Saeed, became so popular in part because Egyptians identified with the murdered young man. He was dragged out of an internet cafe and beaten to death allegedly for theft or weapons possession or drugs possession. These inconsistencies, like in the police stories, lead me to believe this is all absolute bullshit. Like, was it weapons or drugs or theft? Or do you not know because this is just absolute garbage story? So this shows how Egypt's bureaucracy, including the police, acted with impunity and targeted people for arbitrary reasons. Khalid Saeed, who maybe, allegedly, had marijuana, was beaten to death while corruption in the upper echelons ran rampant without any intervention by the powers that be. Egyptian women also gathered online to discuss oppression under the government. From Linda Herrera's Revolution in the Age of Social Media, quote, in 2006, a group of Egyptian bloggers who wrote about women's issues joined forces to launch a website and campaign called We Are All Layla, or Kulna Layla, inspired by the main character of the novel The Open Door by Egyptian novelist Latifa El-Zayat, end quote. And I just want to emphasize here that Egyptian women were very present in both online and offline resistance to the neoliberal Mubarak regime.
Yeah, women were definitely a driving force of the revolution. To go back to Khalid Saeed, we're not going to post this on our Instagram because we did commit to non-gory images. But if you do Google his name, it is actually really fucking depressing because in researching for this episode, I was digging through all these things and you look at the picture of Khalid Saeed that his mom had submitted to the media and he looks like a very fine, pleasant looking young man. And then you look at the picture that was snuck out showing him on the slab in the morgue and his face is unrecognizable. The report I read said that they dragged him out of the internet cafe because the owner of the cafe was like, just take him out, don't do whatever you want to do here. They smashed his head through a wall, through an iron gate and on staircase to the point of like a lack of recognition of his face. It was just awful. Allegedly, they claimed that he died because he swallowed a packet of hashish, but he choked on this packet that he swallowed because he wanted to hide it from the police, which is just insane because anyone who looks at his face in the morgue could tell that this guy was beaten to death. That shows you how rotten the police were in Egypt. The final factor being Tunisia. We did our last episode on that, so I'm not going to get into it. But The inspiration of Bouazizi in Tunisia had obviously encouraged Egyptians who were dissatisfied with the status quo, such that between the fall of Ben Ali in Tunisia and the 25th of January 2011, there were 5 attempts of self-immolation in front of the Egyptian parliament, including a couple of deaths resulting of that.
Just imagine you have to have police watching the front of parliament and other auspicious public spaces because people might light themselves on fire because they're so upset with the regime and their lives under it.
Yeah, I mean, it shows you how rotten the regime is, that instead of trying to figure out a way to make people's lives better, the immediate solution is to deploy a security apparatus to stop people from being so public with their utter hopelessness, their despair, you know? It reminds me of a quote from V for Vendetta, the movie, which I know has been hijacked by like the anonymous types and libertarians and so on. But the movie itself was written by an anarcho-socialist, so there's that, Alan Moore. One of the things the quote in the movie is they mention what will happen if something particular happens. I'm not going to spoil it, but and then Sutler will do the only thing he knows how to do, which is to deploy the army, which I think is apt here because the only thing this regime knows how to do is beat people with a stick, and if they complain, beat them harder.
Right. It's like people are protesting police brutality, so what do? Send out the police.
Pretty much. And so, you know, for this reason, 25th of January is chosen, the official police day, as the day of revolt. Through mass media, social media, and messaging, tens of thousands rally in Tahrir Square in downtown Cairo to protest this police brutality and rampant corruption.
Tahrir Square, also known as Liberation Square or sometimes Martyr Square, has a long history of rallies about everything from politics to sports to deaths of national icons. For this reason, the Mubarak regime planted a heavy police shield around the area. The square itself would become a symbol of the Egyptian revolution and the more communal society it sought to create. Then U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton said on January 25, 2011, so the first day of protests, quote, "Our assessment is that the Egyptian government is stable and looking for ways to respond to the legitimate needs and interests of the Egyptian people." End quote. Shut the fuck up. Oh my God, how are you always so wrong about this?
Shut up, shut the fuck up, fuck off into the whatever woods you live near. Fuck, I hate her so much. I despise that fucking ghoul. Fuck. God damn it. And this is without us going to the Libya episode, by the way. I'm gonna have a stroke on the Libya episode.
Yeah, so right off the bat, just wrong.
Yeah. You could see where 2016's loss came from based on this general arrogance that she puts out. Anyways, the next day, there is mass unrest in other cities, including the Suez and Alexandria, and clashes with the police. On the 27th of January, the government ends up shutting down the internet, fearing this wave of discontent.
Now, up until this point, Egypt had what we referred to in our previous episode as a venting mechanism, the facade of a free press and different parties and associations. Like Amr said earlier, Mubarak sort of allowed this contested election and then cleaned up with like 88% of the vote. So, of course, make of that what you will. These were all closely controlled by the authoritarian government, and shutting down the internet as soon as serious protests began reveals how this was all for show.
Yeah, it shows how little the regime offers people and how few solutions Mubarak and his ilk had, that as soon as protests escalated, their only solution was to shut down the internet. Of course, this resulted the next day, 28th of January, which was a Friday, was declared by the people a Friday of Rage, or Jum'at al-Ghadab, at which point hundreds of thousands rally after Friday prayers in Cairo, Alexandria, and other cities. Muhammad al-Barad'i, who is the former head of the International Atomic Energy Association, or the UN, he arrives in Cairo, and al-Barad'i is someone I don't particularly like because he's a very much sort of liberal, and he was the West's favorite opposition in the sense that if Mubarak were to fall, they were going to throw their lot behind him, which shows you what kind of person he is, in my opinion. Another big thing on the Friday was jails across Cairo were broken into and burnt down, and thousands of prisoners were released. allegedly by order of the Minister of Interior, Habib al-Adli, who wanted to release all these violent prisoners to intimidate protesters. Another thing that happens is that Mubarak gives his first address since the start of this uprising. He promises to form a new government and appoint a new cabinet and prime minister. However, this is nowhere near enough to please what is now fast becoming a revolution. And there are clashes between protesters and a pro-Mubarak mob of people during the day. And the other big thing of this day, the 28th of January, is that the Muslim Brotherhood endorses the protests and deploys its massive, massive base of support across Egypt and especially at Tahrir Square. So from the 25th of January until now, the base of the protests were various disaffected millennials, students, young people, women, and labor unions. But the Muslim Brotherhood sort of throwing its lot with the protesters just doubled and tripled the numbers just by virtue of its large working class base. On the 29th of January, the next day, the military is ordered into Cairo. So the 2nd, 7th, and 9th divisions of the Egyptian army are ordered in. However, at this point, the military refused to fire live ammo on the protesters. The government announced a curfew of people having to be home at 7 p.m. every night, but the protesters defied the curfew and people are streaming into Tahrir Square and staying overnight there by the tens of thousands. And at this point, labor unions announced massive industrial strikes across the country, which shows you that even though the protests were massive, protests are great, but the real power of these rallies is crippling the economic system that enriches this cadre of parasites that is a comprador bourgeoisie. On the 1st of February, Mubarak gives a second address. He promises political reform and not to run in upcoming presidential elections planned for September 2011. However, he does pledge to remain in office to oversee this transition.
As in Ben Ali's Tunisia, this was too little too late for Mubarak. His regime had pushed Egyptians to the limit and they were no longer willing to compromise.
Yeah, I completely agree. It was way too little and way too late. And at this point, despite his addresses, there are very violent clashes between protesters and what are called Baltagiya. And the Baltagiya are pro-Mubarak. I don't want to call them paramilitaries because they're not paramilitaries. They're a mob of men who are allegedly pro-Mubarak, but there are claims that they are plainclothes cops within those mobs, if not entirely composed of them. There are claims that they are paid by the government. There's a lot of, claims and counterclaims, but it's clear that there was a faction of pro-Mubarak people that were looking to start violence. And of course, the protesters were defending themselves as such. So I don't blame them, really. But it also shows the institutional rot across the Egyptian spectrum that while the Muslim Brotherhood is deploying its mass base to support the protest, Ali Gum'a, the Grand Mufti of Egypt, says, quote, "I greet President Mubarak, who offered dialogue and responded to the demands of the people. Going against legitimacy is haram," which by the way means forbidden. "This is an invitation for chaos. We support stability. What we have now is blind chaos leading to a civil war. I call on all parents to ask their children to stay home," end quote. It is hilarious to me because I do want to mention that he is not wrong when he says going against legitimacy is haram. He's not wrong. He's just, there are hadiths of dubious legality that the Prophet encouraged submission to the status quo as being preferable to chaos, which of course is entirely contradictory to the fact that the Prophet was essentially a social revolutionary himself. So, make of that what you will.
Also, one basis of these protests is that the government is corrupt, that Mubarak is a corrupt dictator, and therefore they wouldn't see his rule as legitimate anyway.
Well, yeah, I agree. And to extend that, Mubarak himself ruled and advertised himself to the West as a secular dictator, which for many conservative Muslims in Egypt made him, by definition, ipso facto, illegitimate because of his, secularism / liberalism, etc., etc. So whatever the Grand Mufti says, no one's going to listen to him at this point. He holds no weight with people.
Right, but let's be clear, it wasn't Mubarak's secularism that endeared him to the West. It was his continuation of Sadat's open door policies.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, whatever people want to say publicly, it's his acquiescence to the IMF and the World Bank that made him a good dog to the West's interests.
Right, because the West is very friendly with the Gulf states and particularly Saudi Arabia, which is ISIS with a friendly face. Come on.
I'm going to steal that. ISIS with a friendly face. Happy Meal ISIS. The 2nd of February, the next day, the government unleashes its supporters, the Baltagiya, on protesters in Tahrir Square. The Baltagiya at this point starts riding horses and camels and are wielding sticks. So the irony here is that the battle is called the Battle of the Camel, in reference to a 7th century battle during the first fitna between the supporters of Ali and the supporters of Aisha, which I found hilarious. But yes, they're riding camels and horses into protesters, and the result is 3 dead and 600 plus injured in Cairo alone, and 300 plus dead across the country since January 25th. Fast forward to the 6th of February, 4 days later, and the protests are still ongoing. People are staying in Tahrir Square overnight, clashes with the police daily. On the 6th of February, Egyptian Prime Minister Omar Suleiman begins opening negotiations with the opposition figures, and meanwhile there are clashes with the police. And at this point, the Egyptian National Museum in Cairo is being used as a black site where protesters are disappeared into and tortured. On the 10th of February, Mubarak issues his 3rd address during the revolution, delegating responsibilities to Prime Minister Suleiman but not resigning, triggering particularly violent and intense clashes with the police. The next day, on February 11th, the Supreme Council of Armed Forces, which I will refer to from now on as SCAF, Chairman General Mohammed Tantawi, announces the departure of Mubarak on live TV, and that SCAF is going to assume interim control pending elections. And this triggers massive celebrations in Tahrir Square, including fireworks, at the achievement of their immediate goal.
Unlike Ben Ali, Mubarak didn't flee the country but was arrested and confined to house arrest at the presidential palace in Sharm el-Sheikh, so not a bad house arrest for him. By the time of his resignation, his health was also deteriorating. Reportedly, he was offered refuge in Israel but either refused this offer or wasn't able to flee. I'm thinking the latter.
Yeah, I don't think Mubarak is principled enough to refuse support from Israel.
After a series of trials and appeals, Mubarak was acquitted of conspiring in the killing of protesters during the 2011 uprising and released in March of 2017. He died in February of 2020 at a Cairo military hospital at the age of 91. So just like Ben Ali, nothing really ever happened to this guy. Like, he died of natural causes at a ripe old age.
Yeah, I mentioned this in the Ben Ali episode, and I will bring it up again in subsequent episodes as we talk about other dictators. But he died surrounded by every manner of comfort and luxury, probably in the least painful way possible, surrounded by money and wealth, and there was no justice in any way, shape, or form at his death. So, now that Mubarak has stepped down, we can discuss the day after the revolution, by which I mean the entire period after the revolution. So on the 13th of February, SCAF dissolves parliament and announces a timeline of 6 months of interim control. The protests at this point subside, but a small portion remain, demanding more specific results. On the 2nd of March, a constitutional referendum is scheduled for the 19th of March, and on that day, the referendum passes with 77% in favor. The 1st of April, thousands march to Tahrir Square demanding a prosecution of regime officials.
The Tahrir Square protests are sometimes referred to as the 18 days, as it took 18 days to remove Hosni Mubarak from office. But it's not as though everything was solved after he resigned and people could just pack up and go home. In fact, as we're about to discuss, most problems endemic to the regime have not been resolved.
Yeah, there was little that was resolved in the immediate aftermath of the revolution. On the 8th of April, tens of thousands march again, demanding that SCAF follow through on protests and demands and organize elections, as well as removing old regime officials from their positions. 27th of May of that year, a second day of rage is organized as tens of thousands march again, demanding prosecution of old officials, a return of a constitution, and the suspension of military tribunals for civilians. On the 1st of August, the military clamped down on the weekly protests that have been happening and tear down the tents that were occupying Tahrir Square at this point. On the 9th of October, police attack protesters in Cairo, killing 25 and injuring hundreds. On the 19th to 21st of November, protesters end up reoccupying Tahrir Square and engage in heavy clashes with the police. Now, on the 28th of December to the 11th of January 2012, parliamentary elections are held in Egypt. On the 23rd of January, Parliament meets for the first time since the revolution, with the Muslim Brotherhood having the largest single bloc. SCAF bestows the assembly with legislative powers. On the 1st of February, the Port Said massacre happens, in which 74 young men are killed and over 100 are injured when fans of the local team Al Masri in the city of Port Said invade a football pitch after a match with knives, sticks, and other weapons and attack the Ahli fans, Ahli being a club from Cairo, and the Ahli fans were ultras that during the revolution were acting as the muscle for the anti-regime protesters, essentially using their experience in street combat with the police during football riots against the police in this revolution. And there are very, very credible claims that the fans of Al Masri were, quote unquote, unleashed by security forces as revenge for the Ahli Ultras' behavior during the revolution and their clashes with the police.
It's also certain that police refused to open the stadium gates, trapping the Ahli fans inside.
Which tells you all you need to know about the culpability of the police here. The result of this being the Egyptian League is suspended for, I believe, 3 years. But what is the ultimate thing for me, at least, is this is a good case study on the politics of football and how football is inherently political when ultras are organized politically, insofar as the Ahli fans especially are known to be anti-government and despise the Mubarak regime. On the 12th of April, the court suspends the Constituent Assembly that was organized, citing irregularities and illegal behavior. On the 23rd to the 24th of May of 2012, the first round of presidential elections occur with, I believe, 8 candidates vying for the presidency. A week later, on the 31st of May, the emergency law that has been in effect since 1981 is declared ended, which is a huge and monumentous step and occasion for the Egyptian people, considering that this was one of the key demands of the revolution. On the 8th of June, factions agreed to a new 100-member Constituent Assembly, but on the 14th of June, the Supreme Court of Egypt declares that the 2011 parliamentary election results were unconstitutional, citing more irregularities and error. So SCAF dissolved parliament and resumed temporary control, and I put temporary quotation marks here. So SCAF organized a new 100-member Constituent Assembly and issue an interim constitution. Fast forward 2 days later, the 16th of June, the second round of presidential elections occur. A week later, on the 24th of June, the election results are ratified, and in a runoff between the two top contenders of the first round, Mohammed Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood is declared the president of Egypt, beating the old regime, the ancien regime's candidate, Ahmed Shafiq.
Of course, Morsi only ruled for about a year before a military coup d'etat led by General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi forced him out, though many Arab leaders and the United States avoided describing this seizure of power as a coup. Since we're really focusing on the events of the January 2011 Egyptian Revolution for this episode, it's worth noting how ultimately power shifted more between the security establishment and the military than it did the Egyptian people. But this lack of economic and social change for Egypt doesn't mean that the revolution didn't have an impact on Egypt or the rest of the world. For one thing, events in North Africa in particular showed the severe error in the United States and Obama administration's reading on the region.
Yeah, they were wrong on every level. It is incredible how wrong they were. With that, I believe we conclude the timeline and we can analyze the revolution of 2011 in particular. One of my biggest takeaways from this is do not trust the military. They are not your friends. Egypt, much like Turkey or Pakistan, for example, is a military with a state rather than a state with a military, insofar as, the military own factories, they own land, they produce goods sold on the market like oatmeal, cereal, etc., etc. So the military exists above and beyond the state as such.
Some scholars actually refer to the Egyptian military as Military Inc., again referencing its massive shadowy control over the Egyptian economy and infrastructure. In fact, nobody is really sure how deep the military apparatus in Egypt goes. But its refusal to fire on protesters doesn't necessarily demonstrate any kind of solidarity with the protesters, so much as the realization that the regime as it stood was no longer tenable. The auspices of standing with the protesters would later prove politically advantageous.
And we can get into that in the next episode, which we can discuss the 2013 counter-revolution.
Yes.
Another question this episode raised for me, and one that I don't have a particular answer for right now, is a progressive secular dictatorship better than a flawed democracy? What if a democracy leads to Islamists winning? Should democracy be allowed if people democratically elect a non-democratic or autocratic candidate? I know there have been a lot of criticism of Muhammad Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood via the Islamist policies, but how much of that is accurate? Because doing research for this episode, I found it difficult to spot any overt Islamicization of Egypt. The Muslim Brotherhood, even though they were Islamist by definition, were very careful of ruling by coalition and by consent, and being very careful with their politics in terms of separating their economic policies from their social conservatism.
Right, they're definitely a softer Islamist party, at least at this time in Egypt. Somewhat comparable, I would say, to Ennahda in Tunisia, which we already discussed. They are the Muslim Brotherhood. They are a Muslim party, yes, and it's important to acknowledge not everyone in Egypt is Muslim. There is a huge sector of Coptic Christians in Egypt. There are Jewish people living in Egypt. There are, I'm sure, plenty of atheists living in Egypt. That's an important point as well.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up, actually. Yes. I really understand the wariness and the fear among especially the Coptic Christian population in Egypt, witnessing the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood politically. But there is also a lot of anti-Muslim Brotherhood propaganda, so to speak, from very interested parties in the Gulf, like the Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Again, it goes back to what I was saying. If a majority of people elect something like the Muslim Brotherhood or another a soft Islamist party, should we allow that? Could we allow that? What mechanisms does a democracy have to prevent the tyranny of the majority from harming a particular minority, say in a country like Egypt, the Coptic Christian minority? And, I don't have a lot of answers for a lot of these questions, but I did want to bring them up for our audience. And, if you want to discuss it with us, please do message us on our Instagram. We'd love to have these conversations. Or if you are a Patreon, post on our Patreon page. We will check, and at least personally, I can guarantee you I'm more than happy to answer and discuss.
Right. So then if a majority of Americans, for instance, vote to ban abortion on a religious basis, that's a democracy, but that doesn't make it fair. That doesn't make it good.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of what we consider today to be essential rights, or what many of us consider today to be essential rights, were not entirely popular in their own time. I mean, if you look at polls during the civil rights era, Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., his favorability ratings among Americans, the general public at large, peaked at 38%. So at his most popular, he was only popular with 1/3 of Americans. That just brings you to question, at what point do we need a majority consensus to enact a law that we know for a fact is essential to protect the rights of everyone, including minorities?
Right. And sometimes when a law is enacted, it becomes more popular. I don't know what support for the New Deal was before the New Deal, but I know after the New Deal, it was massively popular.
Oh, yeah, exactly. So anyone who tells you that things like healthcare for all, Medicare for all are bad has no idea how politics works, because once you show to people how useful these things are, there's no going back.
Well, when your rights are in question as well, that is inherently putting you down. When we were having a decades-long discussion over whether people should be able to marry the same sex, that is, of course, homophobic in its own right to sit there at a table and be like, should we or shouldn't we? What does the majority think?
Yeah, exactly. There's no reason why heterosexual people should legislate what homosexual people do between consenting adults.
Exactly.
So the other question for me is, what does a post-revolution justice system look like? We saw Hosni Mubarak was tried and convicted for his role in the killing of protesters, but that conviction was overturned following the counter-revolution and he died a free man. So how far down the chain of command do you go to administer justice?
Related to this question, how much should revolutionaries clean out a sitting bureaucracy and military and police forces? There actually isn't a simple answer to this question. For instance, after the US invasion of Iraq and overthrow of Saddam Hussein's regime, many of his military bureaucrats were banned from working in the new government. But as these people had experience and now couldn't find employment, they became resentful and eventually staffed some of the most brutal anti-Iraqi government militias, including ISIS.
Yeah, exactly. The US reconstruction regime in Iraq, it made it a point to ban anyone who's a card-carrying member of the Ba'ath Party from working in the new government. And when you look at Iraq before the invasion of the US, you had to be a member of the Ba'ath Party to work as a local municipal clerk or something. So for a lot of people, being a card-carrying member of the party didn't necessarily mean you agreed with the party or you supported the politics of Saddam. It just meant that you needed a job that could pay the bills, especially considering the sanctions and such that the US was imposing on Iraq before the invasion. That is all to say, with something like the Egyptian regime before the revolution, how far down do you go? Do you arrest the local traffic cop? Do you arrest the clerk at the local ministry? But at the same time, General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, which as we said, overthrew Morsi and became dictator as we know him today, he was a member of the previous administration. He was a middle officer, a lieutenant of some sort in the previous administration that found himself catapulted to a high position under the Morsi administration. And we'll go into this in the next episode, but perhaps some sort of purge is necessary when you're looking at people whose political interests align with the old regime.
Right, and I think it also comes down to just simply how much power that person has. Like, are you going to fucking clean out the local DMV, fire everyone who works there, and be like, nope, we got to get all new paper pushers? Like, logistically, that is just so difficult. You need people with experience in those jobs to do them.
Exactly. So if you want to discuss that, I'd love to have that conversation as well, because it is a very important conversation, I think. The last thing I'm mulling over is the role of countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia and Turkey in influencing events in Egypt. And, whether the nation state as a single entity, the role is over for it. And I don't mean to, overreact, of course, but you look at, for example, Morsi's Egypt, it found itself very difficult to attract foreign investment because the Gulf's largest bloc, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, they were primary investors in Egypt before the revolution, but under Morsi, investments withdrew and foreign aid dried up because of hostility to the Muslim Brotherhood. So while countries like Turkey and Qatar replaced them in the vacuum, as both are Turkey itself, the Justice and Development Party, the AKP, are a sort of remix of the Muslim Brotherhood, if you will, or an evolution of the Muslim Brotherhood. And Qatar see the Muslim Brotherhood as an ally and a client. They both showed up and they both propped up Morsi. But at the same time, the Saudi bloc was fomenting revolt among the officer class, and it succeeded, which we'll discuss in the next episode. I'm not a Trotskyist by any means, and I want to clarify that, but I do see, looking at these revolutions, the importance of internationalism and international solidarity across national boundaries and with class lines, and how important this internationalism is in upholding a revolution in an age where the forces of reaction, the forces of capital, are themselves global and themselves ignore boundaries and, land borders and so on.
No, precisely. And I think as long as there is imperialism, and there especially is in North Africa and the Middle East, it has to be an international response. There's no other way because people are just going to meddle, sow discord.
Yeah, I agree. So keep that in mind when you look at the way revolution works.
So tune in next week to learn more about the 2013 military coup and counter-revolution in Egypt. As we said before, some of these might stretch out to two-parters, and we definitely have to put this into two parts because you can't really understand the overall impact of the Arab uprisings without discussing that counter-revolution. Like, we can't just stop at Mohammed Morsi and be like, all right, good, done.
Yeah, absolutely. There is a lot more to discuss, I think. So tune in next week for the next part of this. The next part will rely on you having listened to this to make sense of it. So please do listen to this two-parter. It's great to have everyone. We do thank you for your support. It does mean a lot to us. So I will hope everyone has wonderful holidays and Merry Christmas, and see you next week.
If you like our content, you can find us on Patreon. Link is always in the description of the podcast. You can follow us on Instagram, where we post photos, maps, things like that. Nothing graphic, nothing gory. And just keep telling your friends, listen, subscribe, rate the podcast. All that stuff really helps. We just love to watch it grow. We love interacting with you guys.
Yeah, you guys are great. So until next time, bye. Everyone.